Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started with this session. My name is Reese Hester. I'm a former research fellow at Robina. I'm currently the deputy director of the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing. Looking forward to this panel with co-presenters from the U.S. Sentencing Commission and from the Robina Institute, and I'll let them introduce themselves when they get up here. I'm just going to jump right in to my part. All three of these presentations this afternoon are on criminal history scores and in their relationship to recidivism and recidivism risk. And so you heard this morning how this is a big deal, and this is something that Robina, I think, and Professor Fraze and Professor Roberts really deserve a lot of credit for bringing these issues to our attention and to making them parts of the projects for Robina. So I'm just excited to have been part of the work and then to carry it on forward into another jurisdiction, Pennsylvania. So let me get right into what I'll be talking about. So we know a couple of things. We know that in guideline systems in particular, we don't know as much in non-guideline systems, but certainly prior record matters. But in guideline systems, prior record has been quantified and made a mechanical part of a person's punishment. So this is the very colorful Pennsylvania sentencing matrix. You all, in typical Minnesotan fashion, have quite a stoic white and gray. Most of them are. I don't know. We couldn't be better at some things, so we went for more color, I think, in Pennsylvania. But it's in many respects quite similar to what I'm assuming most of you all are familiar with the Minnesota guidelines grid. And you have a disposition line. We have a couple of disposition lines, but really it's similar. And in both and in sentencing matrix in general, you have offense gravity that delineates the north to south portion of the grid, and then the prior record score is what we call it in Pennsylvania. You call it the criminal history score here in Minnesota, and so they're really similar in that way. In other respects, criminal history scores vary quite a bit. So in Pennsylvania, you can see what we put into ours. We have point categories, and then we have some special categories. Our points range from 1, 2, 3, and 4. We include felonies and juvenile adjudications and misdemeanors. So in those respects, it's quite similar to Minnesota, and so this is the grid and this is the framework. So when we're talking about prior record enhancements and issues of mass punishment and issues of racial disparities, it give you a couple of examples to kind of set the stage of what we're talking about. So in Pennsylvania, and the numbers are different and the categories are different in Minnesota, but it operates very similarly. If you let's pick 9. I hope you can see some of the numbers there. But if you have a prior record score of 0, you've never been in trouble in your life, and you commit a level 9 offense, your recommended punishment would be 12 to 24-month minimum in Pennsylvania. And then as you move along, it gets much larger, much more quickly. I was in the last session, and Julian was talking about this very thing. And we know this also. We know that in every jurisdiction that we've looked at data from, that African American offenders have more extensive prior records than white offenders. And so systematically, the matrices are building in more punishment for people with longer prior records, and systematically that disadvantages minorities. As Professor Fraze said this morning, if you have disparity like that, there may be times when that's justified, and you make the policy decision that it's unintended disparity and it's unfortunate, but the overriding policy is important and we're going to retain it. So this is the question: is this overriding policy important, and should we retain it? We could have prior record enhancements. We might ratchet it up the numbers as we move across because of issues of retribution. They deserve more punishment. There are a lot of problems with that, and I don't have time to get into them, at least for now. This session is really going to focus on the recidivism part. Is is the prior record score a valid and good and salient measure of recidivism? And so that's what we'll be talking about. Okay, so I'll give you just another brief way that we've quantified it. Here at Robina, we call it the criminal history enhancement. If you take this guy with just the glasses, first-time offender, but let's assume that he commits exactly the same offense as the guy with the beard and no glasses, and I don't know why I picked those two, because I'm fond of people with beards and glasses, but anyway, not to cast dispersions. But the difference in punishment for these people is almost 700. I mean, it's substantial, right? The guy with just the beard is getting 6.67 times the punishment. He's getting 10 years versus a year and a half, not because of what he committed, the crime that he currently committed and is being held responsible for. Not because of the victimization that he caused for the event that he's being held responsible for, but because of things he did before, which presumably are things that he's already been convicted for, he's already served his punishment to society for, and he comes back through and yet very, very different punishment. So setting aside the retribution question, one of the reasons why we might do this is because we think it's a proxy for risk, and it certainly is true that past behavior is predictive of future behavior. So is it that predictive? And when at some point, 30-something years ago, the Pennsylvania Sentencing Commission and the Minnesota Commission was doing something contemporaneously, or a little earlier even, these categories were laid out. If we assume that this is on the basis of risk of recidivism, is it really? I mean, can we look at that and say that a person with a 5 has a higher recidivism likelihood than a 4, especially given the way that these things were constructed? So I'll go back just a little bit. There's no subtitle to my talk, but if there were a subtitle to my talk, I think it would be the hot dish approach to criminal justice policy. And what I mean by that is that, for the most part, these things, the one exception is the United States Sentencing Commission, and you'll hear from Tracy a little bit later. But for all the states, these things weren't empirically derived. It's like a hot dish. I'm from South Carolina. I didn't know what a hot dish was. I moved to Minnesota, and I found out what a hot dish was. And it's basically a dish, and it usually has cream and mushroom soup. And nowadays it's got tater tots, and then it's just a little bit of whatever the person wants. And sometimes it turns out nice and tasty, and then sometimes people offer you, their pickled tuna hot dish, and it's a disaster. And there's no, right, because this is not done by a recipe, it's just the tater tots and a lot of other stuff that you throw in there. And if you look, so we have... to peddle our wares. There's a lot of books for sale out there. This one's for free, and you get what you pay for, but my colleagues and I, this Criminal History Enhancement source book, I literally, just a few minutes ago, saw a guy pick one up, and this is how much time he spent with it. And then he put it back down. So I don't know if your cursory review, you at least you take one home with you. But we surveyed guidelines jurisdictions and found a tremendous amount of variation in the things that go into the score and how much they count. And so it really was not a very empirically derived. There's a lot of intuition and kind of back-of-the-envelope approach to coming up with these scores. And so now we can come back and ask the question of whether that intuition correlates with actual recidivism outcomes. Here's just some of the multiplier differences across jurisdictions. This comes from the source book, and you can see in some jurisdictions the prior record score, the extremes, it only about doubles the sentence, and in some jurisdictions it's 1,000% increase or even more. So in some places this matters a whole lot. In every place it matters a lot, but in some places it's just astronomical almost. I'm going to try to move through briefly and get to the actual empirical analysis that I've done in Pennsylvania and share some of the results. But again, some of the reasons why these things matter are all the reasons that we're here to talk about today, because they have direct racial impact. and they also have direct fiscal impact. One of the reasons why we have mass incarceration is because we put a lot of people in prison, and we put them there for a long time. And one of the reasons we put people in prison is because they have prior records. And one of the reasons we put them in there for longer is because they have longer prior records. So this is directly relevant, really, to the whole spirit of what we're talking about today. Now, again, and there may be questions, and we can, I don't mean to shut them down. We're happy to talk about the retributive part, the just desserts part, but the focus here is on risk. And Professor Foreman in the last session actually made this point in a question that he was asking the panelists, where he said that when he goes and talks to judges, a lot of times what he hears the judges talking about with prior record is that it's an issue of recidivism. How much more likely is this person to reoffend? It's public safety. It's what we care about, and justly so. In Pennsylvania, there's at least some evidence that the prior record score was in large part about that very thing, about public safety. If they've done it before, aren't they going to be doing it again? And isn't that a reason why we should punish them more? So I think it's at least very relevant, if not the most important justification for why we might be doing these things. All right, so I'll try to keep this non-technical unless you have questions about it, but I'm going to look at two things. One is taking that prior record score. We have 8 columns in Pennsylvania. And so at least implicitly, we're making the assumption that we've distinguished, if this really is about recidivism and about public safety, that we've distinguished among 8 categories of offenders, and that zeros are going to be the least likely to recidivate, and that the highest category will be the most likely, and that there will be a difference between 3s and 4s and 4s and 5s, and so on. All right, so does the grid actually do that empirically when you go back and try to validate it? Is one question that I'll answer with survival analysis. And then secondly, what about all these subcomponents? I mean, some jurisdictions, Minnesota and Pennsylvania included, use misdemeanors and juvenile adjudications, but not everyone. It'd be hard to imagine a jurisdiction that didn't include felony offenses at least, but there are a lot of other ways that you can either include or not include aspects of the prior record, and every point gets you more punishment, but does every point equally predict your likelihood of recidivism? Or are some of these much more marginal in their benefit or even gratuitous in the punishment that they result in? All right. So I have tables and all sorts of things, but I'm just going to jump to the visual aid, if that's okay with everybody. These are results from the first question, the survival analysis question, and it's hard, and I can't really. Sometimes I can point to those lines, but those are pretty tall. But if we've got 8 categories, in the 8th category there were so few offenders I had to drop it, so there's really 7 categories shown. But if those individual categories really distinguish differences in recidivism likelihood, controlling for a whole lot of other factors that I control for over on the left side, then we would expect to see 7 distinguishable lines, and the statistically significant tests and results should show that there are differences in those offenders on that basis. So I can see a lot of people with funny looks on their faces, so I should probably explain a little bit more. So these are the survival rates or the recidivism rates, the reciprocal. And the dark blue line up at the top are individuals who have a prior record score of 0, first-time offenders, and their survival rate would be somewhere around 70%. So it's pretty, about in the 70% range. So maybe 30% of them fail and recidivate, but those are the least likely to fail. They're the most likely to succeed. And so what we'd expect is that as you advance in prior record score, that you would go down in your survival rate. And for several of these categories, it is true. The maroon dashed line is prior record score of 1. The green dotted line is prior record score of 2, so there's not as big of a difference there as you might think, but it's there. But then there's kind of a problem here. If you can tell, the next lines actually overlap. So if you have a prior record score of 3 and a prior record score of 4, there's actually no difference in your likelihood of recidivism. And then there's a gap between PRS 5, and I'm calling it PRS 6, but we call it repeat felon. And there's no statistically significant difference in those two categories either. So if we really care about making distinctions, and we think we've cooked up a prior record score that uses all these weighting schemes and different points so that we can find people who are more likely to reoffend and are a greater threat to public safety. At least in Pennsylvania, from this preliminary analysis, we would want to do a little bit of tweaking to this score to reflect actual differences, because there are some places, I mean, we're punishing people with a 4 more than we're punishing people with a 3, even though it's not actually reflected in their recidivism. I'll have to do this very briefly. The area under the curve analysis, and again, this is kind of a hard thing to read, but the area under the curve analysis is a measurement of accuracy prediction. And so column A is our current prior record score, and since I don't have time to dig into it a lot, I'll just say that you can interpret this as a percentage. So it's about 59% accurate. If we just considered in Pennsylvania whether you had any prior record versus no prior record, the accuracy would only fall 1 percentage point to, so we could have 2 columns and the accuracy would be substantially the same, down to 58%. If we just counted, it's the same 59%, so our weighting scheme doesn't seem to add anything. If we take away misdemeanors, which add punishment to a lot of people, it only drops in accuracy by a point. And if we took away the juvenile points, it would drop in accuracy a little bit more. Okay, so I'll just say in transition to the next panelist that there are other issues, and you might have other questions to unpack. It still doesn't answer the question, for example, of whether we should double or triple or quadruple or what the magnitude of difference should be. But at the very least, it seems like if we care about recidivism rates, that sentencing commissions have a burden to empirically validate if they didn't empirically derive their prior record scores, so that they're making meaningful distinctions among offenders. And Julia, are you next? Tracy is next from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. So happy to take questions at the end, and thanks.
So I'm Tracy Kicklon from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. I will, every 8 to 10 years, we like to validate our criminal history score with recidivism data. So I'm going to give you the latest data from our latest criminal history report, which is came out a few months ago. So yes, the name of the report, The Past Predicts the Future. I'll give you the website at the end of the presentation. So as with many sentencing guideline regimes, offenders' criminal history score is one of 2 key considerations in sentencing under the federal sentencing guidelines. And for each criminal conviction or juvenile adjudication in an offender's criminal record, it's assigned either 0, 1, 2, or 3 points. And I won't go into great detail. For those of you familiar with the federal sentencing guidelines, they're in a great big book. And chapter 4 of that book is the criminal history section. And so if you are interested, you can go to our website and look at chapter 4 and get all of the details. But the main factors is that points are based on the nature of the offense in the offender's criminal history, the length of the sentence that was imposed by the court, the age of the defendant when he committed the offense, whether it was a juvenile adjudication or criminal conviction, and either when the date of the sentence was imposed or when the offender was released from prison. So these events are then, these criminal history convictions, the points are then added up to get a criminal history score, which can range from 0 to infinity. And then these points are classified into 6 criminal history categories. And the criminal history categories are what's used to sentence the offender, along with final offense level. So this presentation will provide information about the components of Chapter 4 of the guidelines and their association with recidivism. Total criminal history score, criminal history category, and point assignments for individual past convictions. These data are from our ongoing recidivism work. We've had a series of publications on various different topics of the sentencing guidelines and recidivism. It takes 25,431 U.S. citizen offenders who were either released from prison or placed on probation in calendar year 2005. We followed them for 8 years to see if they recidivated, and we measured recidivism primarily by rearrest, and that was primarily because rearrest records are generally better than reconviction records and reincarceration records. We know there are problems with every measure of recidivism, but we went with that one because the records were generally better than the other 2 measures. So this looks at rearrest rates by criminal history points. So this is just the 0 to however many points that are assigned to each offender based on their criminal history. Also, this presentation is color-coded, so the points in the same color are in the same criminal history category. As you can see, for most points, as you increase, the rearrest rate goes up. I think there were 2 exceptions, but all of the points in the same category are lower than all of the points in the next category. So in CHC1, there are 0 and 1 point offenders, and both 0 and 1 point offenders are lower than 2, 3, and 4 points, or 2 and 3 points, and 2 and 3 points are lower than the next category, and so forth. I will give just a couple of slides on reconviction and reincarceration. You can see that the pattern holds for reconviction, basically holds, and then it holds again for reincarceration. This looks at rearrest rates for criminal history category. So it goes up by each CHC. This breaks down age and criminal history and the rearrest rates. Within each criminal history category, the youngest offenders, those are the darkest green, have higher recidivism rates than the other offenders, and it goes down for each age category. The older you get, the less likely you are to recidivate, and that holds within each CHC. This is time to rearrest. So how long it takes for the offender to be rearrested the first time once he was released from prison or placed on probation. The CHC1 is the lightest colored line, and that's at the bottom, and it has the lowest slope. So it takes the longest for those offenders in CHC1 to reoffend, and they don't reoffend as quickly. They also have a lower overall rate, as we've seen. And then for each criminal history category, they reoffend more quickly, and they have a higher recidivism rearrest rate. Next, we looked at the most serious offense for which they were rearrested. Of all of their rearrests, what was the most serious offense? For those in the criminal history category 1, the most serious offense was public order, which in our ranking system was the least serious offense. So that was the most common rearrest offense. Serious. For the rest of the categories, it was assault. We also broke out distinctions between those offenders within criminal history category 1. So in criminal history category 1, you can have offenders with 0 points or with 1 point. You can also have offenders, within those who have 0 points, you can have offenders who have nothing on their record. Not only do they have no convictions, no stale convictions, which are convictions that timed out, no minor convictions, and no rearrests, so they have nothing on their criminal record. Then you can have 0 point offenders who have either stale convictions, or minor convictions, or arrests. And then you have 1 pointers who have something that counted, but it was a minor offense and only received 1 point. Looking at those with absolutely no criminal history, they were rearrested at a rate of just under 26%. It took them 27 months on average for their time to first rearrest, and their most serious rearrest event was public order. Looking at those who had 0 points, but who had either a prior conviction that didn't count for whatever reason, or they had a prior arrest but no convictions, their rearrest rate was 37%. It took them 27 months to be rearrested, and their most serious rearrest offense was public order. For those who have a 1 point offense, their rearrest rate was 47%. It took them less time to recidivate, 25 months, and their most serious offense was assault. And so the point of this slide is that even within criminal history category 1, there's distinctions between different types of offenders based on their past record. So looking at offenders who have just 1 point offenses, they don't have any offenses that were serious enough to receive 2 points or 3 points. They have lower rearrest rates and longer times to rearrest compared to those with 2 points and 3 points. And you'll see that the rearrest rate for those who have 2-point offenses but no 3-point offenses, and those who have a 3-point offense, which means they received a sentence of 13 months or more for that past event, their rearrest rate's about the same. And actually those who have 2 points but no 3-point events are actually a little bit higher. But we can see that the reason for that is because those who have a 3-point offense are generally older. If you break it down by age category, those who have 3-point offenses within the same age category have generally, for most age categories, have higher rearrest rates than those who only have the 2. And so this is a list of this is our website where our research is, and this is a list of the links that will get you to our various recidivism reports. And so now I'll give it to Julia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Laskrinsky. I'm a research scholar for Robina. So I'm happy to present on our research on Minnesota's criminal history score. I want to thank both Reese and Tracy for already explaining the importance of examining the criminal history enhancements formula as well as the criminal history scoring formula. So I'm not going to try to convince you of the importance of this research, and I'll just jump right into my research questions and results. So the 2 research questions that I'm going to be focused on is how well does the Minnesota criminal history score predict recidivism? And also I want to start touching upon a second question, which is how closely does the sentencing enhancements formula align with the relationship between criminal history score and recidivism? So that if there's a positive relationship between the score and recidivism, and we can kind of already predict from the other 2 presentations that there will be, right? Does that also align with how the sentencing formula works in terms of increasing the sentence length and severity as the criminal history score goes up? So this is a Minnesota sentencing guidelines grid. It's similar to Pennsylvania's. On the left-hand side, you see that there's offense severity, and on the top, you see a criminal history score that goes from 0 to 6. It does cap off at 6. And in the shaded region, there's a presumption that you're going to get a stayed sentence, meaning that you're not going to go to prison. And if you're in the light section, you're presumed to have an executed prison sentence. So you can jump pretty quickly. So if you're kind of in the middle of the grid, you can jump pretty quickly, having a score, a criminal history score of 2. If you get 1 more point, you would be more likely to you would pretty much get a prison sentence unless the judge decided to sentence you below the recommendation. So Minnesota considers pretty similar factors to Pennsylvania in the criminal history score. There's the number and seriousness of prior felony convictions. They also consider misdemeanor convictions. They're worth less, so it takes longer to get a point with those. Felony juvenile adjudications are considered if you're under the age of 25. And also they have a custody status point that they give, and that's just like a little extra bonus point that they give if you are convicted of an offense during either probation or parole or any type of custody status. So we already talked about some of the purposes or the logic between having criminal history enhancements and the justification for them. There's a retributivist philosophy where you sentence offenders to longer sentences because you feel they're more morally culpable because they've committed offenses in the past. And really what our research focuses on is kind of testing out this utilitarian philosophy where we try to see if judges are using criminal history score as a de facto prediction of risk, then does it actually predict recidivism? And then how are they sentencing? And then what's the outcome of that, right? If it does predict recidivism, then are longer and more severe sentences in line with that? Is that going to reduce recidivism? Is that going to incapacitate the offender for the correct amount of time. And Minnesota's criminal history score does state that they do focus on this idea of just deserts, and also they focus on public safety, so it's a combination of both of these philosophies. So in order to answer the question of how well does Minnesota's criminal history score predict recidivism, the data I used was Minnesota sentencing data from 2003. I have a little bit over 13,000 offenders. I took legal factors from there, as well as demographic factors. And for recidivism, I used Minnesota sentencing data from 2004 to 2015. And my outcome variable currently is reconviction for a felony within 3 years of release. I also received data from the Minnesota Department of Corrections. For the offenders that did get a prison sentence, I put in the correct prison release date, so I didn't have to estimate it. And I also took into account parole revocations when they're not at risk for reoffending, so that's also in my model. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but my basic findings, just to kind of, prior to my more important findings, are that sentence length is, it has a positive relationship with the criminal history score. So if running a multinomial model of logistic regression model, offenders, for each increase in the score, they're more likely to get a prison sentence than they are to get a probation sentence with jail or a probation sentence without jail, and also the sentence length increases. So it's not like judges are discounting this score in their sentencing. And the criminal history score in Minnesota is moderately predictive of recidivism. This is an area under the ROC curve. And essentially, the AUC is 0.64. If you remember from Reese's presentation, his was a little bit lower. 0.64 is not bad. That's a medium effect size. I've seen risk assessments with demographic factors that are actually lower than that, so that's not bad at all. What it essentially means is that if you take one offender who recidivated and you take another offender who did not from the sample, there's a 64% chance that the offender who did not recidivate is going to have a lower score. So this is just another way of looking at it, and essentially what this shows is that for every increase in the criminal history score, the likelihood of recidivating goes up by 30%. And this is controlling for other legal and demographic factors. And I want to also point out that in terms of offense severity, much like Reese, I found that there's actually a negative relationship between offense severity and recidivism, meaning that more serious offenders are actually less likely to recidivate. And this is important because as we start to take apart the score, we want to look at which particular factors help predict recidivism and which do not. And I've not recalculated the scores yet. I'm trying to do that within the confines of the data that I have. But in general, if you were going to make a brand new score that predicts recidivism and you found out that severity has a negative relationship, you probably wouldn't then put that into the score to have a positive effect on criminal history, right? So if it has an inverse relationship with failure, currently, the score, you get higher scores, you get higher criminal history scores based on the seriousness of your prior offense. So it increases the score that way. There's actually also an interaction with the current offense in that some prior offenses are actually assigned higher points due to the seriousness of the current crime. And there's also, it also affects how you move across that grid, right? So if, so you move across the board faster, the more severe your current offense is. Whereas on the bottom part of the grid, going from a score of 2 to 3, you may only get an extra month. If you're at the very top of the grid, if you have a more severe offense, you can, moving from a score of 2 to 3, you can get an extra 20 months in prison. So this is the recidivism rate by score. So as you can see, the rate goes up as the score goes up, so everything is looking like it's supposed to. But if you see here, there's actually some interesting stuff going on in terms of how the score goes up. So it's not a linear increase. I mean, it is monotonic, but it goes up quickly in the beginning. It jumps up 7%. Then it hovers around 4%, and it jumps up again a little over 7% at the end. So what that means is that really the bigger differences are on those tail ends. There is not as much of a difference going between scores of 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, as there is going from a score of 0 to 1 to 5 and 6. And part of that reason is at the end, this 6 gets capped. So there are a lot of people in there who technically should have scores of, I've seen as high as 42. But they're in there. They're in there and they're given a score of 6, right? So this is interesting because in terms of how the score increases your sentence length, it increases your sentence length in a linear fashion, but it doesn't increase your risk of recidivism in a linear fashion. So technically, if you wanted to mirror the enhancements to the risk of recidivism, you would probably actually jump up quickly going from, I thought this was a point, but going from 0 to 1 and going from 5 to 6 than you would in that middle part of the grid. But instead, the way the grid works is that it increases linearly. So this is just another way to kind of re-examine what the score does, what the score predicts, and whether the outcome of how it affects sentencing aligns with how it predicts recidivism. So this is some survival analysis. I ran a Kaplan-Meier curve. And this shows that essentially on the bottom you have a criminal history score of 6. And on the top you have a criminal history score of 0. These are the different groups of offenders. And again, you see that the biggest difference is between the 0s and the 1s and the 5s and the 6s. And essentially what this shows is that over time, and I actually moved this out past the 3-year mark to the 5-year mark, is that over time there are more offenders who survive, who essentially don't recidivate as they move along. So the score is important. Unlike Reese's presentation, I don't have any that overlap. Now, if I add in the confidence intervals, they will overlap, but only in that middle part. So 0 and 6 are distinct. And I also did some analysis similar to what Tracy did, looking at trying to disaggregate offenders who have a score of 0. So with the Minnesota sentencing guidelines, you actually have offenders who could have committed an offense and still have a criminal history score of 0. You can get a half point, and the half point is rounded down to 0. And I wanted to see if offenders who I call true zeros have a different recidivism rate from offenders who have a criminal history score of 0 but have an offense. And it is actually a pretty stark difference. It almost doubles the rate of recidivism. So offenders who have a criminal history score of 0 are almost twice as, they recidivate at twice the rate as offenders who have actually a score of 0. And since this is, and actually the 24% recidivism rate is almost exactly the recidivism rate of offenders who have a criminal history score of 1. But since this is a conference about reversing mass incarceration, I do not want to suggest that you would move those offenders up to 1. So what I will say is that I think this lends itself to a recommendation and a support for a first-time offender discount, a true first-time offender discount. And I have 1 minute remaining, so I'll go over this really quickly because I really liked the graph that Tracy did. And I will actually, the one difference that I have with my graph, and this is age interacted with criminal history score, and this is Within each age category, orange is youngest, yellow is oldest, what the recidivism rate is by every score. What I did is I actually used age at sentencing because I wanted to see whether you could make some sort of policy recommendation, because by the time they get out, there's not much you can do in terms of making a sentencing recommendation for how the score will affect the recidivism. But I do want to show here that even particularly on that lower end, even offenders who have a criminal history score of 0, who have a criminal history score of 1, age makes a huge difference, right? So for people who have a criminal history score of 0, if they're over the age of 45, which is pretty impressive, right? Like your first conviction is over the age of 45, they have a very low recidivism rate. And it's much lower than if their first offense is under the age of 25. So these are very different groups of people. So to wrap up, the Minnesota Criminal History Score predicts recidivism moderately well, 0.64 AUC, but it has components that don't add to its predictive validity. And its relationship to the presumptive sentence does not match the recidivism pattern between the scores. It could be improved. I'm going to skip over my future plans real quick, and you could talk to me about that if you're interested in them. But I do want to just point out some similarities between the 3 jurisdictions here today. In all three jurisdictions, with the federal criminal history score and Pennsylvania score, I mean, the score does predict moderately well, and I think in Tracy's presentation, she showed that it predicts pretty well. But there's always a potential for better prediction to increase the predictive validity with formula tweaks, such as disaggregating the lowest criminal history group, such as excluding offense seriousness from score calculation, and also possibly codifying age into the formula, so weighing criminal history score by age. And for those of you that think that that's a crazy idea, with the Minnesota sentencing guidelines, I mean, they already have policy around age, whereas if you're under the age of 25, your juvenile adjudications are counted. So this isn't something completely out of left field. And really, it creates opportunities for us to re-examine how the enhancements policy can better reflect risk in order to reduce incarceration and increase public safety. And I'm going to end with that. And I don't know how much time we have for questions, actually.
If you didn't hear the question before, Ann asked how I measured recidivism, and it was rearrest or recommitment for a technical violation back to DOC within 3 years. So rearrest for me, Julia, was reconviction.
Hi, I was wondering if your calculations took into consideration the interplay between collateral consequences and recidivism, you know, seeing as sometimes it seems like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because when you commit an offense, you get collateral consequences, which creates an environment where you can't get a job, can't get housing, which forces you almost to commit another offense to survive. So it seems as though it's, you know, a negative feedback loop that feeds into this self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm wondering if your calculations take that into consideration or if that's actually something that is considered at all.
No, I don't. I mean, can you give me an idea of how you would? Oh, okay. I do not take that into account in terms of my statistical analysis. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I take this into account when I'm writing about why a higher criminal history score would be associated with recidivism. So I think what you're trying to say is essentially it's not that the offender is continuing to reoffend because they're a criminogenic person. It's like the criminal history score in itself is almost causing further recidivism because of the
for
sanctions.
Instance, with theft, you committed a theft offense. Because you committed a theft offense, now you have a criminal history. Therefore, in order to survive, you commit more theft offenses, and it's if that makes any sense, as just an example.
Yeah, I think in terms of taking a broader look at the implications of this, definitely I consider it, but not in the actual calculations unless you have an idea for how that would happen.
No, but I agree. I think it's a good point. There is some evidence, not from well, a little bit, but some evidence that increasing the length or the punitiveness of a sentence actually has criminogenic effects. So people who have do propensity score matching. So there are ways that you can design studies to try to look at if you take two similarly situated people, but one, for whatever reason, gets a longer sentence, and then on the back end goes back out, and what's the difference in recidivism, that people who get longer sentences either are not less likely to reoffend or might even be a little bit more likely to reoffend. So there's ways that you can design studies to do that, but I don't know exactly how. I don't know how you would put in some correction factor or something to, and so I wouldn't make that inference from what I've presented. But so I think it's a good point.
Thank you.
I have a question kind of in the same vein, which was, how are you taking into account, or was there any matching, or would you care to speculate on what would happen? Because this isn't matched with people who didn't go to prison, so there's no interaction between either treatment that occurs during prison or the length of time in prison, which, like you said, may be criminogenic or may be a public safety thing. So would you care to speculate at all on what that does? Because I wonder about these findings, because the time of assessment versus the time of release are so far separated. So we don't know what happened in that intervening time. And so what are your thoughts about that?
Well, for me personally, so one of the things that I control for categories of the length of time, whether they were on probation or had less than a year in prison or 2 to 3 years or three, so there's several categories to control for that. It's not a clear message from that, kind of like I was just saying. In my sample, I have about 130,000 Pennsylvania offenders, and so there's certainly you would expect differences. Some would have had treatment, some would have been in prisons where they had better treatment or better options or education programs, and others where they didn't. And so I'm sure there's measurement error in there. And again, it's not something that the design of this study could get at, and I assume that it'd be kind of randomly distributed so that those. I'm assuming that the prior record score is still robust, but that certainly if you had a person with a prior record score of 3, there are interventions that you could do for that person who would bring the recidivism down much lower than people who didn't get that treatment who were also prior record scores of 3. But it's just not something that I was able to control for.
Well, I found that very interesting research, all 3. I congratulate you. This is groundbreaking stuff, and finding out the relationship between the guidelines, criminal history score, and recidivism risk. But I just want to push back a little bit on a slightly complacent, I think, view that because you've got separation across the criminal history categories, tout va bien, and everything's hunky-dory. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Tracy, on your federal data, the gap between 9 and 14 points was 3%. So they're convicted of the same crime, and Mr. 14 points says, why am I getting this extra time? And your response is, well, your category's got a 3% higher recidivism rate. I don't think that's a great response. And Julia, you had on Minnesota, the gap between 2 and 4, categories 2 and 4, was 8%. That's quite a jump in severity for an 8% increase in recidivism risk. So I think the question is, I don't know what the answer is, but I think the question is, how much additional punishment is a 3% jump in the recidivism rate worth?
Well, I will point out that on the score actually was not controlling for offensive, I don't know if this is on or not, but offensive conviction. So it might be that there is a difference between those in the same offense, a greater difference. But regardless, when it comes to policy discussions, that's more a question for the commissioners. I don't want to just try to dodge the question, but we do see that within each age category for the federal system, within each criminal history category, that there is quite a big difference for the age groups as well. And so there is, I would say it's not, I think that's a policy question that I probably can't answer.
Okay.
For you.
Can I make a comment about it? I probably should have said I don't speak on behalf of my commission too. I don't even speak on behalf of my family, so I take it for granted, even though I shouldn't. And so none of these opinions are but to your point, Julian, I mean, if you go back and think through those ranges, for the most part, as a generalization, there's maybe a 30% difference between the ranges and the likelihood of recidivism. And the work that we've done before, I mean, in some jurisdictions, the magnitude of the increase is on average it's 700%, right? So you're talking about a difference of recidivism is 30%, and the difference in increase in punishment ranges up to 700%, and sometimes it's as low as a mere 200% under the federal guidelines, and sometimes it's as high as over 1,000%, and that's for the grid average. On some particular rows of a specific grid, we've seen multipliers as high as 30 times, which is just almost mind-blowing and astronomical, and I think just underscores your point and makes that point again. There's one issue, and that's, are we distinguishing among, even at a statistical level, even if it's small, are we making meaningful distinctions? But then this bigger policy question of, now what? If they're 5% or 15% more likely to recidivate, and we're going to punish them 10 or 20 or 50% more because of that, and then what are we getting when we punish a person 50 or 100% more because of their prior record? Are we getting a 100% reduction in the likelihood of recidivism when they come out on the other side? And I think the answer to that is definitely not. I think that's all. Thanks so much for being a great crowd.